Hi, I'm Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and former university professor. In this episode, I'm continuing my series on tech prudence. Following up on our last episode where we talked about the hidden dangers of new technologies. And you may remember that in that video, I discussed that some new technologies are a little bit like kudzu. They can spread very rapidly and sort of sink their roots deeply into our lives. And then they're very hard to eradicate if it turns out that they're a bad thing. So how do we identify those technologies that run that risk so that we can be more cautious about inviting them into our homes, into our schools, into our communities, and so forth? I offered 4 questions. I sort of teased you with 4 different criteria that then I promised to explain in subsequent videos. And here is one of those subsequent videos. I want to talk in this video about what is it that makes certain technology so easy to use. That's our first criteria, is ease of use. And I think I'm going to couple that with, and that we are motivated to use. Okay, so that it is naturally motivating technology, easy to use and naturally motivating. Why those 2 criteria together? Because both of them are piggybacking off of the maturationally natural properties of human minds. Okay? A lot of us think that we come into the world with a blank slate for a brain, that what humans are really good at is just learning everything and anything. But that's not how it works. Humans are animals, it turns out. What? Yeah. We really are animals like many other kinds of animals, that we have kind of what look like instincts or learning routines, is probably a little more precise. That is, we've got mechanisms and proclivities for learning certain things in certain ways. This has been well known in psychological sciences for a long time, that, for instance, if you want to train up something as relatively simple as a pigeon, it's easier to train a pigeon to peck for a food reward than it is to get them to peck to escape a shock. Things people did to poor pigeons back in the 50s. But it's easier to get a pigeon to learn to flap its wings to escape a shock than to flap its wings to get food. Why would that be? Well, because there's a natural learning association between pecking and getting food in pigeons. That's kind of what you do as a pigeon to get food, is you peck things. And if you're a pigeon, you escape danger by flapping your way, you fly away. So a shock is a danger, you flap to avoid the shock, but you don't flap to get food, because then it misses your mouth because you're busy flying, and that's not where the food is in the air if you're a pigeon. That's just to say pigeons have a natural, what's sometimes called preparedness, to form certain kinds of associations over others, or to learn certain things over others. And this is true of arguably all animals, okay? As far as we know, all animals have these kinds of learning proclivities, and animal trainers know this and try to take advantage of that to get dogs and horses and even lions and other circus critters to do all kinds of cool things. That's true of humans too. We've got certain learning proclivities that are just part of our natural equipment as being the kind of animal that we are. Now, ours is a little more abstract and a little more sophisticated in some ways, but we've got those routines in there. One that I've shared before, really easy example, is that humans have a natural tendency to form a fear association with snakes. Okay, a baby can see mom react in fear to a snake one time, and now the baby will be afraid of snakes. At least a lot of babies will be. It's a typical kind of fear association to form, even if the snake is not actually dangerous. True of monkeys too, by the way. And these experiments have been done. But it's really hard to get a baby to become afraid of a flower, because there's no natural reason to be afraid of flowers. So you would have to work very hard to get a baby to become afraid of a flower. There's a natural learning mechanism for making us afraid of snakes. It's a preparedness, is sometimes the language. Well, this is true in lots of other areas that are not quite so simple, but are maybe much more pervasive. Developmental psychologists, especially those doing what's called cognitive developmental psychology, have learned that within the first few years, or even sometimes in the first few months of life, babies have certain typical ways of making sense of the world around them, of organizing the information around them to make sense of how things go and how their bodies go in that world around them too. Sometimes this is called folk causation or naive theories of the world around them. It's been suggested that babies are a little bit like scientists in the crib, Alison Gopnik and Andy Meltzoff's term, where babies actually are exploring the world around them, creating little theories to account for what they're seeing, and then adjusting those theories based on their interactions with the world. The metaphor can be pushed too far, but it's helpful to think of babies as having little either theories, these sort of folk theories, or you might think of as sets of conceptual gadgets that help them think about how certain things cause other things to happen in the world. Causal cognition, it's sometimes called. One example of this is sometimes called folk or naive physics, that babies in their first few months of life rapidly start interacting with the world, showing evidence that they expect that ordinary physical objects in the world around them, just sort of brute physical objects, have certain properties. So a 5-month-old baby already shows evidence through some pretty clever experimental paradigms, shows evidence that they expect that a physical object will tend to stay exactly where it is unless another physical object whacks it, okay, and launches it. And then when that thing starts moving, it's going to move continuously through space and time. It's not going to just jump from point A to point B, jumping the space in between. It's going to move continuously. It's also not going to move through barriers, okay? It's got to go around the barrier. It can't go just right through it. It needs, by about 7-month-old, maybe even earlier, they understand support. That physical objects need to be supported or they fall to the ground. These are different examples of the kind of things that babies expect of bounded physical objects. It's called folk physics or naive physics, and it seems to be in place well before babies are 1 year old. If you're interested in that kind of work, Elizabeth Spelke, Renee Bayerjean, and many others have done lots of really cool experiments in that general domain. But physical properties, or folk mechanics, sometimes it's called, is not the only domain in which babies have these kinds of natural learning proclivities, but also having to do with biological things. Now, these develop a little bit later in life, it looks like, at least that's where the evidence is, but certainly preschoolers already have a tendency to sort animals by certain types of criteria. So they tend to think things like that possums and raccoons are more similar to each other than possums are to koalas. Whether that's biologically accurate or not, they take into account things like the general morphology or shape of an animal, its ecological niche, its behavioral repertoires, and things like that, what it eats, how it moves, and so forth, in order to taxonomize animals. And this seems to be something that babies all over the world do. Doug Medina and Scott Atran have done a lot of work on that sort of thing. Babies also tend to think that natural living things have some kind of an essence, a hidden essence that holds them together as a category of things. And they have some unseen vitality that sort of moves them, that motivates them to act in ways to get nutrition, to stay alive, etc. Lots of different things. It's a very big, vast literature of developmental psychology looking into all of these different ways in which babies, sort of all of us, regardless of culture, have a tendency to think about the world. The details get filled in on, depending on where we are, what we've been taught. But the broad brushstrokes, at least, are there as just by virtue of being human beings growing up in normal human environments. And so this is sometimes called maturationally natural cognition. Let me give you another example, one that's particularly important for some of the examples that I'm going to want to talk about with technology. Things like babies by 9 months old are already showing signs of clearly differentiating between those objects, like these basic physical objects like foam brains, that have to be moved versus objects that move themselves. A difference between what we might call just bounded physical objects and intentional agents or beings. Agents move themselves in goal-directed ways because they want to. Or you kind of come up next to them and go boo, and then they run away. 9-month-old babies get this, and they interact with these different objects in different ways. So if they come across an ordinary object and they want it to move, they knock it over. But the typical 9-month-old who wants a human to move will make a vocal utterance. They'll babble at them. They will gesture toward them. They will try to verbally get them to move, even if they can't really speak at that age. Key difference between how they interact with agents versus non-agents, ordinary objects. That's part of the equipment that we seem to have naturally. Technologies then that are being developed to be really easy to use have to piggyback on the way that we ordinarily learn things, the way that it's easy for us to think by virtue of, again, just our natural cognitive systems, our natural ways of thinking and making sense of the world. So objects that follow these rules that we learned really early in life are technologies that are really easy to use. That gets pretty technical. So you have to know something about that psychology to start picking out, well, what are those features? But our scientists who are developing a lot of our new technologies in areas of human-computer interaction, or what's called human factors, when working with other kinds of technologies, how to use a tool well and stuff, are not only considering how human bodies fit with things like keyboards or chainsaws, weapons, or whatever the technology is, but how we think, how human minds work with those technologies. One of these old examples from artificial intelligence systems like library search platforms showed that when people put in a search term, hey, find a book about widgets, if the library search platform came back with a response too quickly, people thought it was an error. And so they'd do the search over again. So they sometimes would build in deliberate slowdowns to make the search seem more plausible to the human user. No, it didn't search hard enough because it didn't take enough time. Go back and take more time. What's going on there? Well, humans are sort of loading their natural expectations that to do something that difficult, it requires a certain amount of time. So I want the computer to, spend some good time searching and not tell me instantaneously that there is or isn't a book on widgets. My point that I'm making here is that technologies, for them to enjoy really strong uptake, need to piggyback on the way that human minds naturally work. That makes them easy to use. As I'm going to explain in the next video, sometimes it also makes them very motivating or attractive to use. But that's enough for now. First question about whether a technology is likely to spread rapidly, broadly, deeply, is it easy to use? And by easy, I mean, does it take advantage of the way that human minds naturally work? If it does a good job piggybacking, pushing the right buttons in our heads, making it easy to think about and easy to interact with, that stands a greater chance of spreading widely, a little bit like kudzu. So that's question one. I'll come to question two next. So tune back in. As always, like, subscribe, and share these videos. Leave your comments. I do try to respond to them if I feel like I've got anything worth saying. But until next time, let's try to stay tech prudent.